Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the first event of the year in the SMSU Visiting Writers Series. I am Marianne Murphy-Zarzana, Associate Professor of English and Director of the Creative Writing Program at Southwest Minnesota State University. Today we're delighted to present a conversation about poetry with poets Marianne Corbett, Athena Kildegard, moderated by SMSU Professor Susan McLean. I'd like to thank Michelle Leininger, Director of the Marshall-Lyon County Library, Paula Nemes, and Emily Rose Rasmussen for allowing us to host our events at this beautiful library and for helping us to promote our creative writing program events. I'd like to acknowledge that we have Provost Dwight Watson with us today. So thank you so much for joining us with your busy schedule.
Thank you.
And more importantly, thank you for supporting the SMSU English program, the creative writing program. It's one of our pillars at SMSU and has been. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, as everyone knows, and we are celebrating 50 years of literary excellence at SMSU that feeds the region. And we have even a charter member here today, Dee Risdahl, who is also a writer, a poet. She has a whole book of alliterative poems, A to Z, which I have a copy of. And so the seeds of the SMSU program, she was art education, but we feed all majors in our English program. So, and I see some of our majors are here, so, and some of our high school English teachers, so, and we have a very close relationship with the high school, with Marshall Senior High School, so glad to have all of you here with us today and all of you who are watching on cable access. So along with the 50th anniversary, our two visiting writers have presented at previous Marshall festivals. Marshall Festival is our literary extravaganza, which is held every several years, that draws high caliber writers to our campus from all over the nation. I'd like to introduce our three writers now, and then I'll let them take it away. Marianne Corbett has a new book out called Street View, and she joins us from the Twin Cities. Marianne was born in Washington, D.C., and grew up in McLean, Virginia, and has lived in Minnesota since 1972 and in St. Paul since 1986. Trained as a medievalist and linguist, she earned a doctorate in English from the University of Minnesota and spent almost 35 years working for the Minnesota legislature as an in-house writing teacher, editor, and indexer. Her poetry is widely published and has won such awards as the Willis Barnstone Translation Prize and the Richard Wilbur Award. She is the author of 3 previous books of poetry, Breath Control, Credo for the Checkout Line in Winter, and Medieval, as well as the chapbooks Gardening in a Time of War and Dissonance. Athena Kildegard's new book is Ventriloquy, and she joins us from Morris, Minnesota. Athena's previous books are Rare Momentum, Bodies of Light, which was a finalist for the Minnesota Book Award, and Cloves and Honey. She received the LRAC McKnight Fellowship and grants from the Lake Region Arts Council and the Minnesota State Arts Board. She teaches at the University of Minnesota Morris. Susan McLean is a professor of English at SMSU. She's a poet, a translator of poetry, and also a professor at SMSU. She graduated from Harvard University with a BA in English in 1975 and from Rutgers University with a PhD in 1990. Her work has appeared in Calliope, Atlanta Review, The Formalist, Iams and Troches, Arion, Measure, The Classical Outlook, Literary Imagination. She writes in the field of formalism. According to an interview with the Poetry Foundation, she describes her love of formalism as, "I am addicted to the esoteric pleasures of rhyme and meter, and I don't even try to deny it or camouflage it with slant rhyme." She has been portrayed as a new formalist by many, if not most, noted critics of her work. Her books include the chapbook Holding Patterns, The Best Disguise, The Whetstone Misses the Knife, and Marshall translated Marshall Selected Epigrams, University of Wisconsin Press. And I give you these 3 wonderful poets.
Hello, I'm Susan McLean, and I'm very pleased to be talking here with Marianne Corbett and Athena Kildegard. My first question for both of you is, how does one of your poems start? Could you talk about what triggered the poem initially, how you knew that it would be the seed of a poem, and then read the poem for us? Athena, will you start?
Okay, I would be thrilled. Thank you, Marianne, for arranging this. It's a thrill to be in this amazing library. It is gorgeous. I had no idea what I was walking into here today. I'm going to read a poem that's in my latest book, Ventriloquy. And I think I'll read the poem and then I'll talk to you about how it started. So it's from a section of poems called Divination, and I could tell you the longer story of how I came to be writing this whole sequence, but I'm just imagining how you could divine somebody's character. And so this one is called By Ice. She tried to keep her mother tethered to this world, held her hand as if it were the feathers of a downed thing, stroked the skin along the blades, talked of a trip they'd taken together years ago when a blizzard trapped them in a scurfy motel along the highway. They watched geese in their harried flight behind snow. Her mother remembered none of it until she mentioned the fur-lined glove her mother dropped, and the next morning found the sky clear, the glove frozen to gravel. So I imagine that many of us have been spent time with elders who are suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. And so there's something of that in the back of this poem, just that sort of, fact in our lives. But the real start to this poem was when a friend of mine, but actually my sister-in-law, told me this story about her mother dropping a glove at a hotel and going into the hotel, and then the next morning finding the glove frozen to the the road outside, or the parking lot outside the hotel room. And that image stuck with me. And it was many years later, really, that it got into this poem. But it seemed like such a beautiful image for what happens to some of us as we age and our mind goes, that we kind of become stuck, right? Or it seems to me that's it seemed like a beautiful image for that. And yet gloves are so intimate, right? They're the thing we put our hands in, and maybe hands are one of the most important parts of our bodies in some way in terms of relationships, right? And so that seemed really powerful to me too, this idea of it being a glove as opposed to maybe your scarf. I don't know if a scarf seems quite as intimate as a glove, because you put your hand into a glove. And so that image stuck with me. And then when I began writing this series of poems, that image came to the surface in the middle of writing these, and so the poem came together. So that's how that happened.
And Marianne?
When Susan prepped us a bit on these questions, I thought, well, gee, that's kind of hard, because these poems trigger themselves in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. So that a rough classification, sometimes a thing happens to you, you are just walloped by it, and either you must write immediately or you can't get it out of your mind and you eventually write. Sometimes you keep seeing a thing, a situation, over and over again in the course of your daily life, and it cuts a groove in your brain, and eventually you write about it. And sometimes it takes reading something later on to make contact with one of those other grooves driven in and to get a poem started. This is a poem like that. And what I read to bring it about was a piece of science writing done by one of my Facebook friends from an astronomy magazine. And I made it the epigraph of the poem, and it goes, "Astronomers have spotted lonely planets wandering in the dark space between stars, hurled out of their own forming solar systems by the violent actions of their larger neighbors." And that's a metaphor, it turns out, in a poem called Vagrant. No actual malice forced him out. The will of God, an accident. When giant powers churn, they rout such lesser beings. He was sent wheeling down unlit alleyways. He has his scars, his injuries, his sidelong moves that mirror ours. We find it hard to track a gaze blasted with scraps of bygone war, or watch his faintly pulsing hopes, lacking the anchor hold of stars, drift out of range of telescopes. And I hope it makes sense that the thing I see in my urban life that makes those two come together is homeless people, sometimes veterans, sometimes not. It seemed the perfect interlacing of experiences.
Each of you deals with form in your poems, but often in very different ways. Marianne, I noticed that you write in a lot of fixed forms, some of which are very common, such as the sonnet and rhymed couplets, and some of the more unusual, such as Anglo-Saxon accentual verse and sapphics, both of which originate from other languages and have different rhythms than English speakers are used to. Could you read one of your poems in a common form and one in an unusual form, and talk about why you chose the form for each? How does form affect the way you write?
Since you mentioned sonnets and accentual verse, that's what I've decided on, and I'm going to start with the sonnet. I'm in the habit of saying that I write sonnets when I'm mad at something. Sometimes it makes sense to call for strict control when you're kind of fired up. This one happens to be not that fired up. I chose the sonnet form because it's a sonnet-shaped experience. It has a switch in the middle of it. It changes from one mood to another, and I'll try to illustrate that as I read. This is called State Fair Fireworks, Labor Day. Look up. Blazing chrysanthemums in rows shriek into bloom above the tilt-a-whirls, hang for a blink, then die in smoky swirls. They scream revolt at what the body knows. All revels end. We clap and sigh. Then, no, another rose, another peony break, flame, roar, as though by roaring they might make the rides whirl in perpetuum, as though we need not finally, wearily turn to plow back through the crush of bodies, the lank air, to buses that inch us, sweating across town, as though we were not dropped in silence there to trudge the last blocks home. The street lamps low, the crickets counting summer's seconds down. And as that went by, it may have gone by too quickly for you to notice that right at the word turn is where the sonnet turns from one mode to another. So one labors to make that happen. Sonnets turn at different places, but that one happened to work. And this next one is in accentual verse, and my reason for choosing it is exactly backwards from it's happening to fit. Rather, I was playing a game with some other poets. We were playing on a Radisphere, as it turns out, a poetry discussion board where I first encountered Susan's work. We were all trying to write pieces in Anglo-Saxon accentual verse. And I came up with this little thing just in play, and it sat there as kind of a joke for many years until a number of years later I revised it, and here it is in a book. This is called Spoon Spell. From the dank deeps under dampened compost, to my amazement, there now emerges almost unspoiled a metal spoon, stainless steel, from the ancient stash of our wedding booty. Wondering how it came there, I mull, and memory mumbles, the sandbox sat there out of the sun, and the great excavations of small engineers 8 hours of summer ages ago. Not a sound now of summery childhood stirs in the yard. Instead, these strangers, tall and tense and text message crazed, very occasionally visit their elders, chewing on worry, stirring up change, spinning out life by spoonfuls of latte. Thus worketh weird with its usual weirdness, spoon as measure of their dreams and mine. But let stealth and steel wool act in this story. Buffed, burnished, and back in the drawer, let the spoon re-up with the regular ranks as though double decades could disappear. Some of you may already know or remember that spell, as an appendix to a word like that, means a story or something related, as in Godspell or gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Athena, you have written a whole book, Rare Momentum of Syllabic Poems, using a syllable count based on the Fibonacci sequence, but more often you write in free verse. You also tend to write poems that are part of a sequence, however, and I'm sure that that shapes your choices as you write. Could you read a couple of poems and comment on the issues of form that affected you as you wrote them? How do you decide that a poem should be part of a sequence, and how does that affect the other poems you write in the sequence?
It's a great question. So I do write in sequences, and I think that's because I'm obsessive. And sequences are the perfect thing for an obsessive poet, right? You get on a track and you just do that. You do the same thing over and over again. We're not the same thing. And I was led to writing poems in sequences because I had the good fortune quite a number of years ago to be at a workshop, and I wrote this poem. It's called The Lilies. Before man first walked the distance between himself and the unfurling sea, before floods, droughts, meteors, before the moon fell into earth's shadow and gravity craved the stars, the lily bloomed, her white tongue without even a syllable to sound, licking up the space around her. So I was living in central Mexico, and I wrote this poem, and there's a really famous Diego Rivera painting of a woman kneeling. You can see her from behind, and she's carrying this huge basket on her shoulders with calla lilies. Can you picture that, the big white lilies? And so I was thinking of that image when I wrote this poem, and I showed it to one of the teachers at this workshop, and he said, you know, this could be the beginning of a sequence. And so that put me down a path of writing a series of these poems. All of them are 8 lines long, so they're little compact poems. and they all imagine or think about flowers and write a kind of a mythology, if you will, for the flower. So the poems are thinking about flowers, but also thinking about human concerns, as you can sort of see maybe in that first poem. So I'll read the last one in the group, and then I'll read one short one that's in the middle that kind of breaks the rules a little bit. So here's the last one. It's called The Marigolds. And so this too, the marigold is a flower that's really important in Mexican culture and in Nahuatl culture. And the word for it in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, is flower of the dead. So marigolds are, when people build their altars on All Saints' Day, they include marigolds because they're the flower of the dead. So that is informing this poem. The Marigolds. To build an altar, one must begin with loss. To know loss is to know the settling of flesh into repose. To touch that flesh is a cursed gift. 1,000 petals are but a beginning, one flower laid upon the dust, a spiked medallion, alive in gold, alive in tongues and eyes. So I think some of our traditions around, and especially in Mexico, but other cultures around the Day of the Dead, is this desire to reach out to the people who have gone before us and hear them speak to us, or we use it as an opportunity to speak to them if we can. And so I'm imagining the flower as being sort of a mediator between these two worlds. So here's another one that breaks the rule. It's 8 lines long, but very short. It's called The Roses. Thorn, worm, thorn, a dozen gods laughing. Thorn, 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 thorn. So that's the whole poem. So I think sequences, I've written a lot of sequences. What I like about them is they just give me an opportunity to wrestle with something for a while. And in the case of these flower poems, it's just wrestling with with a kind of made-up mythology, my own made-up mythology about these flowers, and some of them tell little stories, but also just to be present with these flowers and let them also speak to me and give me the news from flower world in a way, right? So, and then, eventually I just run out of steam. I keep writing them I'm drawing on stuff that I know, like I knew the word for marigolds. There's a poem about orchids, and I had known what the Latin origin of the word for orchids is, and that drove that poem. And so it's just a chance to sort of bring stuff that I know together in one place, if you will. So, it's about play, really. Yeah.
Both of you have written about music in your poems. Athena, you write of playing piano, and Marianne, you write of singing. How do you think that your relationship to music has affected your poetry writing? Marianne, will you start?
Most fundamentally, it's addicted me to rhythm. I cannot even start a poem until I have the choice of a meter in my head. And sometimes I have to backtrack and choose a different meter and start again, but not often. It's unusual, but it also happens that I try to get into my poems the experience of making music. And my principal music making is as a liturgical musician, principally a choral singer. And there are a lot of poems about singing, either as a cantor or as a choir member. in my third book, Medieval, and one or two in my second book, Cradle for the Checkout Line in Winter. In this book, there is one poem with a musical connection, and its connection is that I know a lot of musicians, and I unfortunately also know a number of musicians who've had to retrain as something else. And that's what this is about. Slight bit of information to introduce. The billboard that I'm about to talk about at the start of the poem really does exist on an on-ramp to 94 in town. I think it's still there somewhere. The poem's called Stream. At an on-ramp light for westbound 94, where billboard big fake oriental letters clack for art, songs, chicken wings, she's snagged, yanked back into the sun-warmed flow of Lieder, where Schubert's trout, alive in the piano trill, twists in the air with a shaken spray of droplets and leaps away as the song says maidens must from the line, the seductive craft of the fisherman, whom she can picture there in his hip waders, but who had nothing to do with it, in fact, because the songs themselves seduced her, crooning, "Give me thy hand, thou fair and tender vision," angling with hidden barbs, the love of an art the world shakes off, the meat hooks of her loans, the slivers of her opera chorus pay, with all the other hooked fish, landed and flopping, who started again. Da capo now, clean entrance, the baritone retrained in medical records, the tenor's hands at the wheel of the 16A, the thousand coloratura coders, their dreams of beauty shuddered away like water, lost, all lost. No time to mourn them now, because the signal snagging her has blinked to green. And she must leap, must hurl herself into the churning stream, where it's a hazard to hesitate, to dwell on things, to breathe.
Athena?
Nice. Yeah, so I play the piano, and music does come into my poems, and I attend to the music of poems, the sounds of words and rhythms. But I think the thing that really matters in my life, or the way music it informs my poetry writing, is that when I'm revising a poem and I'm stuck, I'll go to the piano and play a Bach prelude or something by Mozart, some music with a lot of notes that requires complete attention but also gets my body moving. And often it happens that I can go back to my desk, and whatever the problem was that was keeping me from revising the poem has been solved, and I can proceed, with working on the poem. So I think it's partly physical, and it's partly synapses firing across the hemispheres of the brain that happens, when you're playing the piano, and that I feel like that informs or enables my own revision process. So, yeah.
I notice, Athena, that many of your poems have a setting in nature, and you also write often about travel. Would you like to discuss either or both concerns in relation to your poems? What does nature or travel represent to you as a writer?
Mm-hmm. Well, I love nature, and I love travel, so I think that's sort of a simple answer to the question. So you saw with the flower poems, right, that I'm writing about nature in a way, but it's also helping me to think about human concerns. But I also write poems that start with just describing what's happening outdoors, and it's because I spend a fair amount of time outdoors. I like to walk. We have a beautiful wetlands east of Morris, and I'm out there pretty often with my notebook writing. And so I enjoy looking at birds. I can spend all morning watching birds with my binoculars. So it's just a great pleasure for me. So I think it's natural to write about things that you love and that you're paying attention to. So travel is harder because often when we travel, we're just in a place for a little while and we don't really get to know it very well, right? And so I think writing about travel's tricky because it can become, we can grab onto stereotypes or treat the place that we're visiting in overly simplistic ways. So when I write about my travels, I'm hoping that I'm there because it's informing some other concern. So I'll just read you a poem that involves travel. This is from my book Cloves and Honey, which is a book of love poems that evolved out of writing a love poem every day for a year. It was my New Year's resolution, effectively, to write a love poem every day for a year, with the idea that after a year I will have learned how to write a love poem. So I'm not sure that I learned that, but I had a really great time. So none of the poems are titled, because they would all be titled love poem, and that was sort of boring. So here's one that grew out of travel. In the year we were born, Fidel led his corps of earnest men and women into the future. The revolutionaries knew something about poetry. Do you remember the patio where we listened to Flora sing Cuban son, and the owner of the little hotel where Germans sliced mangoes into thin bowls showed us a picture of his grandfather wearing a stiff collar? We were up late and dancing, having walked back from El Centro, past old women in doorways and boys kicking a leathery guanabana as if they were Pele, the air salty and our skin prickly with heat. Some things must be taken a chance on. We were up late dancing on that patio. People say things about making love all night, but I don't believe them. Later, we opened the one window in our narrow room above our narrow bed. The next day, we ran our fingers over the bullet holes in Castro's boat. So it's a poem, right, that gets its power from having been in Cuba, having been in Havana, having gotten to see the boat, this boat. And it's also a poem that's telling a little story about my own life and trying to express some things about love. And, the idea that we have to take a chance on love. But the poem sort of weaves these two things together. So I think this one is successful because it's not it's taking what I know about Cuba, but I hope not sort of sentimentalizing or trivializing it. So.
Marianne, your latest book, Street View, seems to focus on poems in an urban setting, often St. Paul, where you live, but sometimes other cities. Would you talk about your feeling for city life in connection with one of your poems?
I often describe myself as the world's last living adult non-driver. And that has meant that in the 35 years of my working life, I've been on mass transportation a lot. And one truth about buses is that you see everything on the bus. You see inequality, you see diversity in all its features. That has informed a lot of poems in all the books, but they've kind of amassed themselves here. I have written about nature too, and that also sprinkle through all the books, but probably observations about people predominate, and they do in this book. There is a two-poem sequence called Alternate Routes that's specifically about the different kinds of people one encounters on the bus. So when I'm in town, that tends to be what I write. When I'm out of town, I'm a little more golly gee whiz, and I was made a little nervous by your observation that sometimes we write in stereotypes, because maybe I have here. I took a trip to New York back in 2014 on an invitation to read, and it was still winter here. And in New York, it was in the 70s. It was lovely. It was a vacation. I was mostly just floored to be there, but it had other aspects. I'll remind you before I start that Percy Shelley wrote a poem called Ode to the West Wind, and this poem has an epigraph, a visit to New York with apologies to Percy Shelley, and the poem's titled A Slightly Defective Ode to the West Side Y. O noble entry on West 63rd, whose image beckons from the internet in brownstone arches, breathing not a word of shared baths, skimpy towels, and toilettes too redolent of dorms back in the day. Oh, great location, frugal nightly net of rate plus tax, oh, bright five-starred array in blandishments, ratings that claim I'll cop a tidy bargain for my 3-night stay. Oh, plain and simple, nothing over the top. Yo, West Side Y, I'm talking, listen up. Which seems to be the more appropriate phrasing, since all this O is more than slightly twee. But I digress. Done with the eyeball glazing nonstop to JFK from MSP, I'm here, admitted to your inner sanctum, lugging my wheelie toward the mystery. The clerk has offered me my key. I've thanked him. Clueless within the labyrinth, I wander. Those fantasies I had, they're gone. You've yanked them, oh dank halls, clanking radiator thunder, archaic carpets dark with ground-in gum, wet bathroom floors. Later that night, I ponder the howls of student athletes having fun. I fantasize about a loaded gun. But morning. Look to the right, and Lincoln Center gleams like the castles of Les Très Riches, while opposite, the seasons turned inventor of pointillist impressionism, a blur in jonquil and forsythia, magnolias and calorie pears and redbuds all concur. Winter is over. Several cardinal scolas chant early alleluias to the frou-frous in Central Park, the human centifolias, the garden social registers and who's who's. Temperatures saunter toward the 70s, and marathoners blossom in pink tutus, crossing at the museum. There's a breeze. What jaded critic sulks at arts like these? So it's a wash, dear Y. No, it's a steal. How can I whine about the noisy nights and soggy floors when all New York's more real now than it was? Look, when a poet writes West Broadway glitters in a mist of rain, I know now with exactness how the lights conjure that disillusion in his brain, and yellow cabs whoosh past him 3 and 4 abreast. An image trumps a balky drain. It plants Manhattan in the deep heart's core, a solidness I didn't own before, which is the reason I'll be flying back some spring to come to start the day on Broadway, andante in the Starbucks line, and take my almond Danish and my steaming latte under the gold-green trees at 63rd to sip beneath the measured gaze of Dante. Yes, I'm Midwestern, fashion senseless, stirred too slowly for this town's up-tempo zing, fuddled by subways, gawking and absurd, but coming back, in spite of everything, wired up and giddy as this longed-for spring. Thank you for putting up with a long one.
Thank you for reading it.
Many people today feel that poetry is not relevant to their lives. What do you think that poetry has added to your own life? When and how did you first become committed to it? Athena?
Well, so I grew up in St. Peter, Minnesota, and the daughter of a professor at Gustavus who had as one of his first students Bill Holm, a name some of you will recognize. And therefore, Bill was in and out of my house a lot when I was a young person and continued to be a dear friend of mine. And all of that is sort of by way of saying I just grew up in a world of poetry. My parents read poetry out loud, and it was, I've sometimes thought about why it is that my brother and sister never took up writing poetry, because it seemed like so obvious to me that this is what you did, right? At least in my house. But just, sort of writing poetry and not being, I have to figure out how to say this. Even though I was writing poetry from a very young age, I don't think I was truly committed to it until I was in my mid-30s. When I went to this, what ended up being 2 summer workshops when we were living in Mexico, and was around people who were committed to poetry and who spoke to me in ways that sort of said, you can commit yourself more wholly to this, right? I was getting this kind of message from other writers in a way that I had not before. I think just because my parents adored me, and if they said charming things to me about my writing, I didn't take it seriously. It just seemed like the words of, adoring parents. So that's really when I became committed to writing poetry. And then that put me down a path of reading more poetry, reading more deeply, more attentively, and reading books on poetic craft by writers like Robert Hass and Jane Hirschfield and others. And I think that then it was at that point that poetry got to be a serious project for me. But at the same time, I think part of why I keep writing poetry is because it's a form of play. So much of our lives are given over to work, right? We work so hard all the time, and then when we get home, we work some more. We do laundry, we clean around the toilet, or whatever it is we're doing when we're at home, and we forget to play, right? And I also think that language is a great gift that we have, and talking and reading and sharing what we're writing is an incredible opportunity for play. So making poetry is a kind of play for me, right? But it's also serious business too, because you can write poetry that gives you pleasure, Ogden Nash, right? But I think we also turn to poetry in our lives to help us make sense of stuff that cannot be made sense of, right? There's a lot of that in our lives. Why did this happen in Las Vegas? It can't be made sense of, right? There's no answering that, I don't think. And yet we have to think about it. We're called upon to think about it. And so for me at least, poetry is also a way of thinking about these things that are difficult and necessary, right? So and also sometimes poetry is a way of writing about things that are pissing you off. So here's one that does that. So this is part of a sequence of poems that are all about imagined saints. And what I'm pissed off about is the way in which we are treating data as if it's a god or something, or in this case, a saint. So this is called The Big Saint of Big Data. And I'll have to say the title again because the title rolls right into the beginning of the poem. The big saint of big data liked to roll. Rolled right over anything. Sidewalks, trash cans, thigh bones. Right of way, causeway, freeway. Called out as she went, "Looky, looky, no mighty, no fallen." Rolled and gathered until she was huge, unintelligible beyond measure, beyond knowing. Came to a thundering standstill, meteorite in a crater of her own making. The big saint of big data could not be moved. With pickaxes, chisels, mallets, spoons, the people gathered around her, dismantled her, little by little, chip by chip, bit by blot, carted off the flimsy milagros, the spiny relics, until only the crater remained, a concavity with no bottom, a bottomless, silty cup no one could drink from.
Thank you. And Marianne?
We've used the word committed a couple of times, and I had to think about that one a while, because I would say, as you said, I fell in love with poetry very young, only in my case, it was a way to make myself very different from my parents who did not have the benefit of education. And it was extremely solitary, a lot of writing that was shared with no one. I'd kept that up, in high school, a little bit in college, and dropped it being way, way, way too busy in graduate school. And then children came, and I basically forgot about poetry as anything but scholarship. And then I got a job that had nothing to do with literature, a lot with linguistics, but nothing to do with poetry. I had no poetry in my life for about 30 years. My lover came back to visit me after my children were mostly grown, and then I committed. I was lucky to find a group of poets online who encouraged me, and I was working out the experience of not being so needed as a mother anymore. And a lot of those poems are in my first book, which is called Breath Control, in which I no longer have any copies of. So there's one of them. I didn't choose a poem to read to encapsulate that, but actually you can find a lot of such poems online if you want to look for them.
Well, I'd like to end by having each of you choose any poem of yours and read it. Athena?
Well, all right, great. I will read a really new poem. This is called What Arrived. We'd gotten up with the alarm, made coffee, checked email in case anyone had written in the night. But what arrived was the usual automatic poem, the automatic announcement, the usual new word with its careful definition, and we ate a piece of toast and went to work. Only later in the morning did we see the news, all the bodies bleeding somewhere on Sunset Strip, not blocks from where we stayed 3 years ago. The Flamingo, the hotel Google said was the cheesiest, and it was cheesy, which made it easier to go into the wilderness like the Chosen did, and the prophet, and the shepherd. But the man on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay had maybe never gone into the wilderness. And all day we carried this news in our hearts, washing it and washing it with the rhythm of the living.
And this is not a new poem, but it has the same topicality in a way. This is called Weirdos, and it has an epigraph, Minneapolis, circa 1973. The talker, I remember. There were more. Eternal campus oddballs, almost mythic in common room and beer chat, but we saw the talker. Stories were cautionary, tragic, and malleable. A dissertation blighted, a prelim failed, and still he clutched the magic wand of the scholar. On the quieter nights, his swooping voice lectured to empty floors in classroom buildings or in the dead lights of library stacks, deserted corridors, the walk above the Mississippi. Bustling, pulsing, intense as 20 full professors, coat patched with duct tape. One detail was puzzling. Each of us seemed to hear spurts of his own discipline, a sort of razzle-dazzle every field in the plunge or buzz or drone of the voice, as though the devil were at play with each one's fears. But how his pale eyes shone, how passionate his gestures in the walkway. And if you met the eyes at night, alone, you thought, the void that sucks the soul away, and wondered briefly if you'd see the line between intense and crazy if you crossed it with your own obsessions. We're all fine now, those who remember this. We teach for just enough to live on, for the muse, for science. Tenure has floated out of reach. I think of him when shooters make the news.
Interesting
Thank you.
coincidence.
Mhm.
That's
Isn't
the last two poems, yes. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming and thank our two readers. And if anybody does have any questions for our readers, feel free to ask.
Marianne, you called it play, and Athena, you called it scholarship. And it just seems like they juxtaposed each other when it comes to the writing of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just interested in this juxtaposition, scholarship on one end and play on the other.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I don't have a scholarly life.
Okay.
But I love to read and I love to learn, and that feeds the play for me. So that's how I would answer your question. But you should.
Well, in my work life, as I said, literature got left by the wayside and only linguistics applied itself. I did work with lawyers and legal writing. But when poetry came back, part of the way it came back was with translation. And I've translated a good bit of Old English and another little bit of Anglo-Latin, and now also a fair bit of Middle French. And that was my way of re-entry into the scholarly life after dropping it for so very long. And sometimes those things will ping other kinds of poems. The translation of Anglo-Saxon helped me to write my own alliterative Old English meter type poems.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, great question.
Anyone else?
Well,
Thank you, because from now on, I'll never see fireworks again without seeing chrysanthemum.
Those are actually technical names for certain shapes of firework patterns, and I did a little bit of research to find that out before I began.
It's a wonderful description.
Okay.
thank you all for coming. And please help yourself to cookies and beverages, juice.